gets a goal? Who got the assist? Who got the assist?
Greetings, everybody. Welcome back to our preseason content here at Who Got the Assist. For this one, we're joined by the excellent FPL Raptor, aka Ross, for I think his third appearance on the show. Love to see you again, mate. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, mate. Yeah, this is the first bit of preseason content we're doing, and I couldn't think of any better way to go into it. Obviously, you both came onto my podcast last season, so very, very happy to be back and talking about our favourite topic, Tom.
Yeah, that's correct. And to be fair, it's one of mine as well, although I'm not quite as like well traveled in the psychological aspects of FPL, or generally. I think I did it at A level, but my interest kind of ended about there. So I'm very much looking forward to having a discussion where I'm not just listening in on the pod the next day or something like that. I can actually tune in and ask some dumb questions throughout the show. So hopefully you guys can answer all of those along the way. In the meantime, though, it's great to be back filming content again. This is the first one that we are recording. We're pre-recording this one. The rest of them, I think, are going to be going out live, aren't they, Tom? But in the meantime, we are Who Got the Assist. On today's pod, we're getting all psychological, of course. We're looking at 5 key areas, pitfalls, if you will, for FPL managers to take into account and hopefully avoid for the upcoming season. And if you remember them, for the seasons to come as well. It's, as I mentioned, a pre-recording during the summer break. So please forgive anything that might not sound quite up to date or quite right. If anything happens with the game launch that we're maybe not expecting, we're treating it as a blank canvas and as if everything kind of stays the same. And we don't think we're going to be going into too many very specific FPL details that we expect to change, but we just don't know yet. What we will do, though, is if anything does change before we send this out, Tom might have to do some quick corrections on top of the pod. So if he chimes in at any point unexpectedly, that is what's happened. And I'm sure Tom will walk you through that as and when it happens. In the meantime, though, I'm going to cut the intro fairly short today. We're being a bit tighter this season. I think it'd be really good to have a quick discussion and a quick reflection on what cognitive biases are and how they might affect our decision-making in FPL. So Tom, Ross, who wants to kick it off?
Yeah, I suppose kind of we come at it slightly differently. We'll keep the academic kind of chat short, but for me, it's behavioural science, behavioural economics. And the idea of that, I guess, I worked in it for quite a few years, as long-term listeners will know. And it rails against the idea of traditional economics, the idea that we aren't sort of economic eunuchs like the economists assumed we were, traditional economics assumes we are. Instead, we're sort of random, irrational beings who are affected by all sorts of impacts due to our evolution and development as basically evolved apes grappling with a stimulus-heavy environment that humans now find themselves in. And yeah, heuristics and biases, I suppose, are the ways in which, I guess, Ross, our brains have evolved to deal with the world around us, right? I mean, that's the way I look at it. But as psychologists, it's kind of the same, because behavioral economics draws upon that world, not to others, but it's slightly different too, isn't it?
Yeah, I think today we'll just spend the entire time saying how terrible we are at making decisions and trying to interpret information, which is obviously very applicable to FPL. But yeah, cognitive biases, we'll often talk about this bias or that bias, and you would have heard about a lot of them today. But that's just how we interpret information, which is, of course, subjective. Everyone interprets information differently, even if the information itself is objective. And as a result, it's often inaccurate. And we will start with my favorite bias, which is called the bias blind spot, which is essentially we are very easily and readily available and able to recognize biases in other people. I could sit here and say, haha, that's confirmation bias from Sam, or this is that bias from Tom. But we find it very, very difficult to recognize that bias in ourselves. And you might sit there and think, no, I'm pretty good at this. And that in and of itself would be the bias blind spot. So if you're listening today and you're thinking, I don't fall victim to these biases, I don't make bad decisions, then that in and of itself is a cognitive bias. So I think that's always a nice way to start, by saying we are unfortunately inherently blind to our own biases and blind to the poor decision making that we often, or at least I often, demonstrate in FPL.
You often, I mean, last year you did very, very well, whereas Sam and I were Well, let's not talk about that. Let's move on to the
That's
New season.
season. We don't need to talk about that anymore.
Yeah, that happened. But yeah, let's get straight into it then. So this episode, we've picked out kind of 5 key psychological questions that FPL managers contend with, and kind of talk about some of the heuristics and biases which underpin these, and what we think, I suppose, we think you could do to tackle it, or not, because it might be the fact that there's just so much going on. As Ross says, there's so much information that some things they're going to happen to you regardless. But the first thing to talk about, I guess, the first question is, how much do I value last season's data? Now, Ross, this is something which I suppose, because we are heading into the preseason rush, or we're in the middle of the preseason rush, I should say, there are loads of different things which impact us. I think we've picked up Semmelweis, the availability heuristic, and confirmation bias of these. And the story of Semmelweis, probably to start off, is the coolest one, isn't it, for the start of the season, especially?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So Semmelweis reflex gets right into that idea, like I said, that we aren't fantastic at making decisions, but it basically, Semmelweis reflex is that tendency to reject new information that contradicts with our already established beliefs. So all of us, whether it's FPL or everyday life, will have a set of established beliefs, whether that's been confirmed over time. And when new information comes in, we unfortunately have this natural tendency to just reject that information. And the reason it's called the Semmelweis reflex is in 1847, there was this Hungarian physician called Ignaz Semmelweis. And this was 20 years before germ theory was discovered. He found that if you wash your hands before performing autopsies and between patients, you can reduce childbed mortality by 10-fold. So this was an incredible finding. And unfortunately, this was rejected. And when you find out why it's rejected, it was quite something. So apparently, the reason they rejected this is because they believed that a gentleman's hands could not transmit disease. It was impossible. How could a gentleman have disease on their hands? So they rejected what was essentially going on to be germ theory for 20 years, the amount of deaths that could have been reduced, because it rejected or conflicted with their already established beliefs. Now, in FPL, luckily, we don't have mortality to deal with. We're just focusing on FPL decisions. But what we have to realize, and this goes to the question of how much do I value last season's data, is we probably have some preconceived ideas about what happened last season. And if you speak to analytical folk, they will say you should really focus on large sample sizes and what happened last season. But what you don't want to do is get into a position where you are so hell-bent on trusting what happened last season that you don't pick up on trends and things in preseason and what's happening right in front of you right now. For example, if a team changes formation, or they sign a new player, or the manager goes for a new philosophy. So I think that's how Semmelweis reflex could apply, in that you want to be adaptive and you don't want to be thinking too much about what happened last season, but at the same time, you don't want to just throw all of that in the bin, because a lot of it could be applicable. So it's about finding that key balance.
Hello, pod fans. Future Tom here. Now, as Sam mentioned at the start, there may be some bits where I cut in, and this is maybe the only one actually I'm going to do. Now, obviously, we filmed this before. We knew of the changes to the game in terms of def cons, double chips, AFCON free transfers, refresh, and so on and so forth. And had we known that, this would have all seamlessly have fitted into our discussion on the Semmelweis reflex. Clearly, not all of these changes were reflected on positively, and I'm not here to open the can of worms again when it comes to positives and negatives, but instead to say that it's really important to consider the Semmelweis reflex when you're considering how these changes to the game may change the way you play, or at least approach the starts of the season. So there may be things such as bench boosting game week 1. There may be things such as thinking about going all out with the chips, even if you've never done it before as a conservative manager, perhaps going for a bench boost 1, a free hit 2, and a wildcard 3. All of these avenues now open to you. So you shouldn't just kind of think, well, I've always done it this way, let's go that way. Because of this new information, it would be remiss to reject that information, in my view, in order to try to make yourself into an adaptive and dynamic manager, as Ross is very keen for us all to be. Also sends to players as well, of course. So players like Anderson, players like Belabor, why the Nottingham Forest defenders like Murillo at 5.5 might still be value. All of these things are now worth considering and not falling prey to Semmelweis. But that's it from me. Love Semmelweis. Enjoy the rest of the pod.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting at this point in the preseason as well, because this season especially, it feels like there's a lot of moving parts with quite a few pretty relevant FPL sides. Man United, your team, Ross, making moves in the transfer market, obviously bedding in a new system, having had Amorim for a little while now. Tottenham, huge movers already. We've got new signings, new manager, new system undoubtedly. Brentford losing players, how much are they going to be affected? So I think this question is going to be one of the key biases we need to look out for in preseason when determining that like game week 1 side, and also the kind of the set of core beliefs that you hold as we run into the season. Everyone obviously goes in with their own thinking for like what what might happen this season. Will it be Man City's year again? Will Liverpool just go strength to strength, etc., etc.? And it's quite important not to maybe hold on to those beliefs too strongly, I suppose, just based on last season data and mixing in with or overvaluing maybe the moves that have been made in the market over the summer and the differences that have occurred. How would you rate those changes so far? Has anything stood out to you in particular so far as something that would massively change your view on a team since the end of last season, or is it much more of like minor tweaks, I suppose, and okay, we're not going to completely throw away all of the data from last season just because a team's changed manager, for instance?
Well, I should say, just to add to what you said, there's so much inter-team like movement in the Prem. Like it's one of the biggest summers I can ever think of in recent memory, where so many players have gone from Prem team to Prem team. So that affects naturally two teams. We look at the Cunha to United, that affects Wolves and that affects Man United. So it's interesting. My kind of motto on this is not necessarily psychological, but in terms of previous seasons, I think you should look at previous seasons for data. So I think I would much rather look at data from last season than how much XG someone accumulated in preseason. I think data from a preseason game is highly irrelevant to me. But things like form, tactics, philosophies, formations, that needs to be picked up in pre-season, because a simple change from a 4 at the back to a 3 at the back, that might mean that a player is playing in a completely different position, and therefore that probably won't have the same level of output that they did in the prior season. So like I said, I think there's a really fine balance to try and maintain.
Yeah, I suppose it's just about kind of being aware of where you're being rigid and where you're bringing in kind of the impacts from last season's to this year's thinking. I mean, you picked up Man United there, Sam. You just got to remember how quickly things can change. Like with no Euro, for example, at the start of the year, I'm pretty sure people were going to be reflecting on how it was last year and not kind of having a clean slate when it comes to them. Whereas in fact, without Europe, with Amorim having the time to instill his philosophy upon the team, which he didn't have last year, we may find at some point that, hey, you know what, Triple United is du jour. Last year, Forest, for example, a really good example. At the start of the year, they were underpriced, but did anyone really see kind of what they did last year coming? Absolutely not. A great psychologist whose name was Yoda gave this bit of advice: you must unlearn what you have learned. And I think at the start of every year, that's very interesting and very important to bear in mind. So yeah, Summarise Reflex, I think is obviously one that should be top of mind when you're thinking about valuing last season's data. Availability heuristic as well, I think, links in very nicely to this. So that's using the most salient or easily memorable thing as a basis for decision making. And I think that we see this particularly at the start of the season, keying into what we were just talking about. Many teams, especially those created by, I guess, managers who are newer to the game, will be dominated by the high scoring players from last year's numbers to a greater or lesser degree of what we may think as being valid. And during the season as well, it should be said, just because a player has scored a brace in the last week, it doesn't suddenly turn him into an asset if it's incongruous with the rest of his performances so far. Hwang coming into those people's mindsets when he had the Southampton game a couple of years ago comes to mind for me, Sam. This could sit anywhere.
United. Really. We weren't in the league.
Oh yeah. Sorry.
Other red and white striped teams.
Red and white stripes.
Yeah.
Starts with an S. Both equally rubbish.
Sunderland this year.
But I mean, it is pretty key, isn't it, to remember that one, Sam?
Yeah, it is. And I think, again, preseason data Ross touched on a minute ago is going to be really interesting to maybe try not to focus too much on. I think the thing that you can gain from preseason is a little bit more of an expectation around minutes and how teams are going to change systems. But I didn't look at Joao Pedro in the Club World Cup, which actually might be a little bit different anyway because it's a competitive fixture. But he scores a brace on his first proper start for Chelsea in the Club World Cup, and then obviously follows it up with a goal in the final. However, just because that's most recently occurred and that's in the new shirt doesn't change everything we learned about him from seasons past. We scored, I think, 10 goals, 6 assists in the previous season. Are we now looking at an entirely different player based on 2 games worth of data in what is the off season, the postseason, I suppose? And that will happen again over preseason. There'll be bandwagons that occur pre-game week 1 based around this bias where oh wow, second coming of Haaland has occurred. We've just found out that Delap is now nailed for Chelsea, and he scored a hat-trick in a pre-season friendly against Gateshead, and all of a sudden he's the player to own. I think that's going to be very important, maybe not to get too carried away with. And I think the first few seasons of FPL, I maybe looked at pre-season data a little bit too much. I think now, over time, managers are more capable of detaching themselves from the data from pre-season and maybe just looking at the formations, the minutes, and maybe even in certain cases not so much the minutes, because we've seen Barco for last season, for instance, and Kunku as well. There's always examples of even that being a little bit of a pitfall. So yeah, an important one to keep an eye on and not forget, especially during pre-season. But as the season goes on as well, there's going to be hat tricks, there's going to be braces scored by unexpected players. That doesn't make them complete must-owns and locked into every team. They're not going to do that every single week, usually, unless you're Haaland.
I would agree with that.
So yeah, I think it's just one of those that is equally important. They're all important, aren't they? But they're all things which are kind of worth bearing in mind. And finally, Ross, confirmation bias, a bit of a biggie. You hear it kind of everywhere, don't you? You hear everyone talking about it, everyone saying it. But it is a very interesting effect, and one which affects us all the time. Like even at work, I find myself, I work in data, and I often find myself making sure I'm guarding against this one, because you can so easily be led down the wrong path.
I would, I mean, again, they're all so important. But if I was to say the most prevalent and important bias probably out there, it is confirmation bias. It's the reason that a lot of people know about it. So all confirmation bias is, it's that tendency to search for and interpret information in a way that confirms your prior existing beliefs. We've already spoke about Semmelweis reflexes, the fact that we don't want to, or we're unwilling to accept information that rejects our prior beliefs. This is that natural tendency to try and search for it. And sometimes you won't even realize it. But I would go as far as saying pretty much anyone that's ever tweeted anything about their team is probably trying to get confirmation bias or trying to get confirmation for it. Because like if you tweet, which option do you prefer, A or B? Very, very few times do you genuinely want a genuine opinion. You're really unsure between the two. You normally favor one of those opinions. And what you want people to do is say, oh, I like option A, if that's the one you want to go for. So this is super, super common. It's even common in like the medical field, right? So imagine a situation where a doctor's examining a patient that's presenting symptoms. What doctors unfortunately will do, and they try and guard against this, is they'll make an initial diagnosis in their head straight away. So someone will present with a symptom, they'll go, in my head, I think it's this illness or this disease. And as a result, what they'll then do from there on in, and again, this isn't willingly, this is without knowing, but they'll search for symptoms and things which confirm that initial diagnosis. What you should actually be doing, and it's what we should do in FPL, you should actually be searching for information which goes against your prior belief and goes against what you first wanted to do, to see if there are alternative things. And I guess this is how, again, it links to last season as well. It's like you might have this prior belief. You might be trying to search for things that support it, right? You think Chris Wood's the one to go for because last season he did really well for you. Last season, he got the most points in XYZ. You should then search for information which suggests that that's not a great pick. And I think we could go through this in every single section, confirmation bias, but try not to lock yourself into something super early. And if you can feel yourself being really set on an idea or really set on a player, think, why am I? Is there any information which goes against this idea or this player or this team? And I think in doing so, just that awareness, I think as Tom said earlier, just that awareness that this is a bias will hopefully allow you to be a slightly better manager.
It's like a Venn diagram, isn't it? You've got all evidence on one side, our beliefs on the other, and where it overlaps is kind of what you actually believe. And you're completely right, Ross, absolutely right, that it's very important, especially in I don't want to kind of take us into news and media and political beliefs, but it's very important to try to approach these things critically, because otherwise you can get in your own head a lot and just build these narratives, can't you, Sam, that potentially preclude you from considering other avenues of thought, other paths, other routes potentially.
Yeah, and I think a few of these different biases work in tandem and in combination to kind of send you down a path. And Ross mentioned it there, but I think it is super important to try and stress test all of your commonly held beliefs going into any game week, especially at the start of the season. has any information been provided, or is it available? Even if it's not readily available, that's maybe if you look a little bit deeper, are you able to, or is that your belief able to hold up to a stress test and the other maybe conflicting data? You can usually find an argument to do anything in at least FPL world. Like, you can always get an argument or a set of data that will favor a player. You could do it with pretty much any relevant FPL player or team going into this season if you really look closely enough. However, I think it's just as important to then also look at the conflicting set of data and the entire range, if at all possible. Or, I mean, we don't all have hours and hours and hours to spend on looking through data every single week. At the very least, find a trusted few members of the community, content creators or otherwise, who you trust to have quite different views on FPL and on different teams, and maybe bounce ideas off of those people or listen to the way they're all thinking. And if they're all agreeing with each other, then maybe that's telling you quite strongly that this is maybe the way to go. However, I think we're about to get onto another bias, which might be guarding against that one in particular. And it is important to do your own research where possible and stress test all of these beliefs, because otherwise you could very easily just end up with pure confirmation bias. I wanted this player all along. I found a set of data that maybe agreed with me, and I'm not going to look any further, because why on earth would I? Life is short. Let me just pick Bruno Fernandes.
You want the opposite of yes men. Like, if someone criticizes your FPL decisions and always questions why you're doing it and says, I don't like, that's a great person to talk to. I don't really chat to people about FPL when they're like, yeah, that's a great decision. I want people that say why. Like, I actually think, have you considered this? Anyone that questions you regularly, they're the sort of person you should be talking to FPL about.
Yeah, exactly. So in terms of kind of this question, how much do I value last year's data? It feels like, I don't think we've given too much voice to it, but I think broadly last season's data is a fairly good guide. You mentioned the analytics guys earlier on, Ross, would probably give the interpretation that, yeah, it's a big data set, but there are loads of different mitigating factors which kind of provide a bit of a difference between the incoming season and the outgoing season. You'll have heard me for many years say that the worst generals plan to win the last war rather than the next one. And I think it's kind of folly to think that the incoming year will mirror the outgoing one. And it sounds like we're kind of thinking it's best to kind of, I guess, almost strip back, take time to think away from the coalface, I guess, of tinkering all the time, and let ideas marinate and stop yourself getting in too far into your own head. And try to be as hard as it is, as objective as possible. And during the season itself, there's going to be so many situations where you're pressurized, you know, when you're confirming captains and transfers at the point of leaks. And I know that it's not going to be as easy as we're saying now in the beautiful sort of quiet time of preseason, when we're all kind of sat there making transfers as much as we want. But do that as far as you possibly can, I think, to make sure you've got those plans in place and you're fundamentally happy with your understanding of what's going on. Let's move on to the next one. So how much should I think about or plan ahead in FPL? And there are so many things here, Ross, aren't there, which could definitely impact this in terms of the psychological stuff.
Yeah, this is one of those really strange ones where I, in 2 consecutive videos, can tell someone that they would be crazy not to plan ahead, and they absolutely the worst managers of those that plan ahead. And then the next video I'll say, but don't book in transfers, don't plan too far ahead. and it's like, well, should I be planning ahead or should not? And again, it's kind of that cliche saying that there's this very fine line between you want to have a plan and you want to know what's happening, but what you don't want to do, and I think that's what all of these biases we're about to go into, is you don't want to sort of like lock yourself in place. I think that's where you can fall victim to these biases, is when you come up with a plan and it's a very rigid, structured plan. Often I get people say, what would be your one bit of advice? Lots of new content creators make these threads on Twitter at the start of the season. What's your one bit of advice for new managers? I always say be adaptive and dynamic. When I do better in FPL, it's when I respond to what's happening, but then at the same time, you need a plan to at least adapt to. And I think sunk cost fallacy, Tom's probably quite a nice place to start with this.
Yeah, I think you can put a lot of these things into the bucket of being too stuck in your thought process. Sunk cost, I'll spare you the experiment of a ski trip experiment. But it basically, the idea is continuing a perhaps inferior course of action despite a better alternative being presented. And that can often be due to time, effort, or money invested. FPL wise, it's normally time, effort, and maybe talking to people about what you're planning to do over the next few weeks. If you've kind of really personally invested in the fact that you're working towards bringing in Haaland for a really good run of fixtures between game week 8 and 11, but it actually looks like keeping Salah is a good idea, there will be that sort of feeling that you want to stick to where you stick to your guns in some ways. There's belief perseverance as well, where you continue to maintain the same beliefs when proved wrong. I'd rechristened this the Andy Martin effect for FPL purposes. Yeah, sorry, Andy, you know I love you. But yeah, it's definitely one of those sunk costs, especially. You'll see this all the time across social media, Sam, where you'll see. I think we're guilty of this. I'm not saying that we're not guilty. We're definitely not falling prey to bias blindness here. But it's definitely one of those things that you'll see kind of everywhere, and you're like, okay, I completely see why the fixtures do sort of potentially suit that idea, but actually, it might not be worth going there because what you've got now is doing fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's an element of the plan continuation bias as well that creeps in here as well, where you're already down a set path. You've been presented with new information that might conflict with that path, whether that's a new double game week coming on the horizon, maybe a player has returned from injury a little bit sooner, or a player has gotten injured that you weren't maybe expecting, that might shift the dynamic in a team you are otherwise not even planning on coming into. So, for instance, if Gyökeres, again, this might date the pod, if he signs for Arsenal, might get penalties, but then gets injured, Saka might then become a better FPL option all of a sudden because he might well be back on penalties without Gyökeres up front. So taking in that new information and not disregarding the plan, but using the information that you're presented with and baking it into the plan to see, again, stress test mentioned yet again here, whether or not the plan survives this sort of new set of information, new set of data that you're given, is really important to consider at all times. And the sunk cost fallacy, it doesn't just relate to, okay, I've got player X, it seems to be sensible to move to player Y, but I'm not so sure. It also is relevant for how many transfers you've used. So maybe you've brought in a player last week and it immediately looks like that was a bad call. I'm not going to go into the million and one reasons that might be, but there was plan A, plan B. You've gone with plan A. It very quickly looks like plan B is, for whatever reason, objectively the better plan. Maybe, like I said, a double game week gets thrown in the week after. It's very easy to just be set in your ways, be very stubborn about it. Like, no, I've gone with this plan. I've used transfers. I might have to even take a -4 or go further away from my initial plan to get back on that other path. And there's an element of sunk cost there as well. So again, it's strong beliefs to begin with, but loosely held. If things change, be flexible and be willing to be dynamic with your planning if needs be.
I will just say, like, I think even knowing all this, timing is everything in FPL. Like, if you were to say the most important thing in FPL, it's timing, because at some point in the season, every player is good, pretty much.
Yeah.
And at some point in the season, every player is bad. And I do think that even knowing about plan, and by the way, there are so many biases that show that we're stubborn and closed-minded, like Semmelweis reflex, sunk cost fallacy, plan continuation bias, belief perseverance, commitment bias, conservatism bias. All of these are just biases to say we're really stubborn and closed-minded. But it's still finding, like, I'll give the example of last season. So I went without Haaland at the start of the season. It was an absolute horrid decision. In hindsight, it worked out horribly for the first 5 game weeks when he scored 11 goals. I was then wildcarded in game week 7. I think game week 6 and game week 5 and 6, like around that time, he had a couple of games where he didn't look quite at it, Haaland. And I had this decision to make. I was sat there thinking, right, so I've got 5 games where he's done exceptionally well. Then he's looked a little bit off the boil. So my plan was always to wildcard him in because I made a horrible decision, get him in and get rid of Salah. That was the plan. And then I looked at it and thought, am I being overreactive based on a couple of games? Am I changing the plan too quickly? Or is the correct thing to do to change the plan? Should I now be updating the plan and not falling victim to plan continuation bias? Even myself, as someone that's very well read in psychology, I still didn't know what the right answer was. So as much as we can talk through these biases, it is still very, very difficult to try and time these decisions and know when is that sweet spot, because it's different for every single decision. But when is that sweet spot of when it changes from plan continuation bias to stubbornness and reactivity? And that's the fun of FPL, is that we never know and we're always going to get that wrong. But I do think at the very least, just knowing that you are probably unfortunately, unless you're a saint, probably quite a stubborn, closed-minded person, then I think that's a useful thing to know when you're making your decisions.
Yeah, we all like to think of ourselves as the main character in our own story. Unfortunately, this is the way it is, and you're always going to try to, I guess, cast yourself in the best light. And self-serving bias, isn't it? Where you, I guess, your decisions are always distorted by. The best way to think about it is it's like an athlete or something like that who's likely to, if they've had a good outcome, attributed to their amazing ability. If it's a bad outcome, it was raining, my spikes weren't quite the right size, my coach gave me some terrible advice, and
just variance. It's just variance,
exactly.
Or it was a content creator's fault.
That's definitely true.
We'll talk about that in a minute. But it's certainly one of those things, and that sounds like that's a very good example, Ross, of how you can, I suppose, think about how that tension of there's plan continuation, there's sunk cost, but equally there's also kind of my analysis of the ongoing situation, how it's unfolded. Example like Haaland, started all guns blazing, but there are some interpretations of what I'm seeing in the data that maybe do kind of put pay to the idea that I should be changing tack. And it comes down to judgment at the end of the day, and that's the hardest thing, I think, when it comes to thinking about how far you plan ahead and how far you react to things which are happening in front of you. Because as we saw earlier on with confirmation bias, there may be something that you look at and think, okay, everyone's kind of saying this. Let's look at some information. I'm finding that this player is scoring loads of goals. It's great. Hang on, this content creator, that content creator, this article, that article is all telling me I need to buy this player in, and being kind of aware of your own judgment, I guess, is what the decision sort of deal breaker should be in many ways. I suppose the final thing here, in terms of planning ahead, especially kind of think about this when I think about people who are looking kind of 5, 6, 7 game weeks ahead, or even thinking about chip season now and things like that, is decision fatigue. And basically the relationship between your decision ability and the quality of those decisions. And the idea is that decision quality diminishes as decision quantity increases. And I did some quick sort of back of a cigarette packet maths earlier on today, and I was thinking, as a normal week, you got 15 decisions on squad placement, including the bench order. You got 2 captain vice transfers. You got up to 5 these days, or even more. But assuming you normally have 1, that's 18 decisions per week. 18 times 38 is 684 decisions per year, albeit some weeks you won't feel like there's decisions to make. You're going to roll, leave the team the way it was. Throw in your 15 for game week 1, 15 players for game week 1, which is a lot more decisions. Chips, don't know how that looks yet. Wild cards, I guesstimate you're looking at maybe 800 to 900 decisions per year. And that's a lot of decisions, really. And if you're doing that, overthinking, Sam, can really hurt. And I suppose mitigated and moderated by your decisiveness as an individual, you definitely see decision fatigue creep in. Like, I think we definitely had that last year, where we were kind of debating all sorts of ways to approach ship strategy and ship season, all sorts of ways to debate, all right, this week, am I missing out by buying this player at the expense of kind of this player having a 5 game good run? It can get very difficult. And as you said earlier on, you can end up just kind of thinking, right, screw it, I'm just going to buy this player and get on with it. But it should be something we should guard against a little bit.
Yeah, it should be. And I think, look, as human beings, we are prone to maybe trying to simplify what is a complex set of data. There's only so much information we can possibly take in per week. And I think at times I've personally run into problems almost trying to defy that human limitation of how much content can I possibly consume, how much data can I look at? And I end up looking at so much that I lose the perspective on which the most important, most salient points are. and maybe lose myself in the forest, and not able to really gather what the most obvious move is, because I've just been thinking about it for far too long, and have almost, that, is it Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where they've got the big wall chart meme? Is that the one where they're pointing at everything?
Where Charlie
that's the one. That's how I feel like most game weeks at the moment, especially when it gets to like double game weeks season. So yeah, that's where decision fatigue comes in. I'm sure there's a fair few people who can relate to that as well. And I'm trying to maybe simplify my process a little bit, have a set amount of content creators that I listen to, and a set amount of data that I farm from, I suppose, and people that I trust within the community as well. And hopefully that will reduce the amount of information that I'm intaking, and giving myself more time to think through the decision myself. And quite a lot of the time, Tom, you know this better than anyone, I make my decisions quite late so I can gather all the data. But that can also mean that maybe the decision isn't just fatigued because I've been thinking about it all week, but it's also rushed in a weird way, because I'm only leaving myself a very small amount of time at the end to maybe come to a conclusion. So I think those two things actually work in tandem against me. And that's one thing I'm really trying to guard against this season, is that decision fatigue. So this is a really important one for me. Interesting to hear what you guys think.
Go on, Russell.
Yeah, and I don't have much to add. I think you two covered it perfectly there. Sorry, I should have just.
I
was nodding on screen, but I think what I would say is, I think work out what works for you individually. Like Sam and I are sitting here thinking 800 decisions across the season. I have that many across 1 week, but that works for us because we're content creators. We enjoy it. If you're feeling fatigued, you feel like you have too many decisions to make, I actually think planning ahead can often really help with decision fatigue. Like if I know what I'm going to do for the next 5 game weeks, just execute the plan, do an Andy Martin, and don't change the plan. That's fine as well, because that means that in 3 weeks' time roughly what transfer you're making. Then that might help. But I think all of this is personal to you, and something which I'll try and remember to bring up at the end is do what helps you enjoy the game the most. At the end of the day, if we're sat here and saying we'd plan 3 to 5 weeks, use this amount of data, use this tool, but you're thinking I'd much rather not plan at all and just do it week by week, then do that. You might end up beating us. I wouldn't be surprised. So I think it's all individual and personal.
No, I was going to say, to round this bit off in terms of how should I think about a plan ahead FPL, it is very subjective, as you've given voice to there, Ross. And I feel like kind of the overlying kind of overriding sort of salient point is always going to be to try to guard against getting too much in your own head. I think that's very important. And as Sam mentioned earlier on, simplifying your process can help, but it's very much about what suits you. It could be that, listening to all those different voices kind of helps you build a council of your own of all these sorts of bits of information. You're able to synthesize a solution that works for you. For me, it doesn't really work to have loads of different voices, because I get kind of muddled and lost in what I think is the best thing. And it can be incredibly sort of personal, I guess, in terms of how you digest information and how you then apply that information to your decisions, which feels very sort of neutral and very sort of meh, doesn't it, as a conclusion to this particular bit. But I think that's very, very key, because some people do like, as Ross said earlier on, to plan ahead, and that completely works too. I'm not denigrating those people at all. I didn't mean to earlier on. Nor Andy Martin. I do love Andy. Right, okay. I think the next bit, I think we've kind of touched on this a few times. How much do I trust others' views versus my own? This is really important in the landscape we now find ourselves in. We're all here. I think you two are content creators. I'm just here as an innocent bystander within this.
You're a content creator, mate. You've been doing it for years. You create content. Come on.
Good lord. But yes, I think there's lots of different sort of areas which impact this. My favorite one, and you will have all heard me do this before, is the framing effect. And I'm going to mention 2 players now to you both. I think everybody knows what the outcome is. So 2 players here. Player one had a pretty meh year. He was 25th in underlying stats. He had really rubbish per 90 data. It was the 5th best year for that of his career. Barely got half his shots on target. Regressed in terms of his XG per 90 for his team by a significant margin. Took less shots than the likes of Garnacho, Szoboszlai, and got very lucky by massively overperforming on his data by scoring nearly 7 more goals than he should have. So yeah, it was just a year of blind luck. Definitely not worth a look for the year ahead. Player 2 had a great year, one of the top scoring players in FPL, 200 club, 5th overall and 8th overall for XG, and showed all his experience in being lethal, outperforming his underlying data, hitting 20 goals for the first time in his Premier League career, and outperforming his price bracket by quite a long way. You'd be an absolute idiot for missing the spearhead of a team on the up. Both these players are, of course, Chris Wood. And I think the framing effect for Ross is really important, isn't it? And how, I'm not saying that everyone kind of does this consciously, but thinking about all the things that we've spoken through already, it's the case that anybody who is putting together a case for a certain player to fit what they think is best is going to naturally fall prey to the framing effect.
Yeah, like even so, I'm obviously very aware of the framing effect. But if I turn up to a video and I sit on the fence for every player, as we said, it's a bit meh. Like it doesn't sit right. You wouldn't want to listen to that person. So I have to turn up and say I like Chris Wood. I was going to say I like Wood, but not this podcast. So I like Chris Wood. Now, if I'm saying that, I'm immediately then going to frame it as this is his nice data. As you just said, you could then frame it in the other way. So it's even, you could go something as simple as this player scores 20% of their shots versus this player misses 80% of their shots. It's the same stat, but the miss versus score, it just inherently frames it in a certain way. So this can be the case, especially if you're listening to content creators, because they undoubtedly will frame things a certain way. But you can even frame it your own way when you're looking through data in terms of what you're seeking, which goes back to kind of confirmation bias. Something else which I love is Tom's framing effect there was actually bringing into play something called belief bias, which is basically the idea that we judge how successful or true an argument is based on how convincing the conclusion is. And this is a bit of advice I can give you for if you have an interview or a speech or you're trying to convince someone of something. The actual makeup of your argument doesn't largely matter if you nail the conclusion. So as long as you nail that end bit and you make it sound successful, then, or sound accurate and sound convincing, then you'll probably be quite successful in convincing someone to do something.
My whole career there, Ross. My whole career.
if I sit here and say this player is this, and you're like, oh, I'm not convinced by that, but I finish with it, and that is why you have to bring in this player. But actually, I see this all the time with threads on Twitter, and I'm not going to call out any specific people, of course, but I'll see an entire thread and I'll be like, oh, there's some suspect stuff in there. And then the final part of the thread is, and that is why this player is absolutely key for this game week. And I'm like, how do we arrive there? But often you do skip towards the end of a thread. And so my bit of advice would be don't skip towards the end of videos, don't skip towards the end of threads, and actually listen and read and try and think about whether the argument holds weight. But unfortunately, yeah, when we're watching, humans are susceptible to so many biases. That's the whole point of this podcast. So unfortunately, as much as the three of us would like to be perfect in terms of the way we create content, we are going to frame, we are going to suffer from confirmation bias, all of these things. So realize that we are flawed humans, you're a flawed human, and together that creates lots of flaws and biases. But yeah, framing effect's fun because a lot of people don't even realize they're framing.
I love the fact we're going to be the only preseason podcast that is calling out you, the viewer, as flawed human beings. So hopefully you take that.
Just click that. Just click that little bit there.
Yeah. But that was an excellent point. I really enjoyed that. And I think maybe it was a very convincing end of the argument there. So maybe I'm falling victim myself. I don't know.
There we go.
But no, very, very good. And I can easily call to mind 5-10 times where I've probably done that myself in my videos. I've done it probably on this pod, and I've consumed content in which I haven't even noticed that that's happened to me. And then I've done the move and I'm like, wait, but actually look at all this conflicting data. Why didn't I think of that last week? It's because of the way it was framed. And that also, I think we kind of skipped over it earlier a little bit, but that also can be relevant to the bandwagon effect as well, can't it? Because if there's a ton of people all framing something the same way, whether that's on X, on Blue Sky, or in all of the content that's going out that week, we could also fall victim to the framing effect there because the bandwagon just seems so convincing in itself. Maybe that is the closing argument that everyone falls victim to, is just there's just such a vast amount of people going there, therefore it must be great. But that's not the case, is it?
If so many people say it, it must be true. We'll definitely talk about going with the crowd in just a moment. And it's definitely something which I guess reflects in what we hear all around. There's loads of different things we could talk about. Outcome bias, the illusion of validity of the idea that you have overconfidence in your own predictions, the messenger effect as well. You find some people more credible than others. Law of instrument, I think, Ross. So I saw that you included that in our WhatsApp chat. I hadn't heard of that one before. I looked into it. The golden hammer. It makes it inefficient as we try to use the same skills in one part of our life to apply to another.
I love it.
All sorts of interesting stuff, like the Einstellung effect makes us very inefficient when we're trying to figure out our own thoughts on it. I mean, explain away. I've never heard of this one before.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting one. So the reason I bring this up is I think it's one of those where when I studied psychology, I'm still studying psychology. I've been studying it for about 12 years now, and I'd never come across it until I wrote my book, and I was just trying to find every possible bias that's ever existed. It's basically when you over rely on one tool. And I think why that's so applicable to FPL is we have so many tools available to us, and we can go back and forth on whether you should use one tool, two tool, three tool, 10 tools. And we spoke about decision fatigue and having too much contributing to those decisions. But I would always rather have multiple tools in my arsenal than just have one thing that I over rely on. And I always use the example of XG and XA because I am very much a believer in expected data. We're not going to get into that right here, right now, but I think it's quite a predictive tool in FPL. It's one of the better ones, but it is far from perfect. So let's say I'm a person that doesn't watch football, doesn't look at other data, touching the box, shots in the box, XG delta. I just look at expected goals, expected assists. I think you could finish very well in FPL using that. But I'll give the example, and this was a real life example. It happened a good few years ago now. But I remember De Bruyne pinged an 80-yard ball over the top, and it was about to land on Sterling's foot from about 4 yards out. And Sterling just completely missed the football. I mean, it didn't get anywhere close to his foot. If you then look at XG and XA, Sterling had 0 XG, De Bruyne had 0 XA from that specific set piece of play. But what that doesn't take into account is De Bruyne is playing beautiful passes. His vision is on point at that point. Sterling is getting to some really good positions. And so if I'm over relying on expected data, I'm not taking into account any of that other stuff. So the best way to try and explain and sum this up, there's a wonderful quote from Maslow. So this was back in the 60s, but Maslow said, I suppose it is tempting if the only tool you have is a hammer to treat everything as if it were a nail. So the idea here is that if you just treat everything with the same tool, then you'll always arrive at the same solution. And in FPL, that's a nightmare. If you're always arriving at the same solution, you're not being that dynamic adaptive manager that we spoke about. So I'm not suggesting that you sit here and have a spreadsheet with XG, XA, shots in the box, and then you have touch maps and eye test, and you ask a survey of 100 people what they think. Like, it can get over the top. But if you think you're someone that is always rejects XG and you're like, I'm an eye test manager, maybe just look into it. Or if you're someone that thinks that the eye test and form is silly, which a lot of analytical managers don't even believe in form, and they think the eye test isn't required because the eyes are faulty, I would maybe consider taking that into account. So yeah, I don't want to tell anyone how to play the game. And if you've got a tool that works for you, an algorithm that just does everything perfectly, then great. But try not to over rely on one tool wherever you can.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add on to that is goals ruled out becoming a bit of a data phantom almost, a little bit. That's what immediately came to mind for me, Ross. And those sort of things are missed in the online data, aren't they, Sam?
Yeah, there's the example you gave was a great one, Ross. There was one last year with Munoz. I think at the start of the season, he was getting to the back post a lot, at effectively right wing, and the ball just wasn't quite getting to him ever. Like, his touches in the box was low. He wasn't getting shots away because he was in the positions, just for whatever reason, Mateta was creeping in front of him. It was getting blocked. It was offside, whatever it was. And for so long, it just looked like he was a busted flush as a bit of an FPL pick. And then just started finding his way to him at the back post, and he just started getting on the ball in that right wing area, just inside the box. And all of a sudden, the data starts looking really convincing, but people are slow to it because there's been data that has never really been jotted down anywhere relevant or in the ways that we'd normally read the data, because again, we've only got a limited amount of time in our days to look at FPL stuff, some more than others, of course, but you're not realistically going to go through the full 90 minutes of every single match and jot down, well, that's the 5th time Munoz could have received the ball at the back post. You're just not going to do that. So it's very difficult to stay on top of all of that. But yeah, that's where eye test is really helpful. That's where other data points that maybe even the most analytical managers might be able to improve their game a little bit. And I know things balance out, and the very analytical managers will say, well, you know, that's minimal in the grand scheme of things and it won't affect my play too much. But you can always improve that 1%. And I think even the most or the closest to perfect FPL managers I can think of could still benefit from extra data and opening their perspective even more than they are already doing. So, yeah, I think that's a great bit of advice.
It goes both ways as well. Like we're basically slightly bashing on data here and saying eye test is great, but it goes the other way. Like I remember back when I started, I used to watch a lot of football, like extended highlights and stuff. And then when I started to look into data, I was like, I just didn't pick up a lot. I really truly see myself as understanding football quite well to a high level, but you just can't pick up on everything because you're watching the ball for the large spell. You're not always watching what the right winger's doing at that specific point. It might even be something as simple as the camera doesn't even show you at that angle what one of the players. So you can't just, even if you watched all the games in the world, you can't observe all that, which is where data comes in and is incredibly useful. Because instead of watching 12 games, I can instead just look at one spreadsheet. So yeah, I don't think, and we're not going to get into eye test versus data too much, but I don't think one is better than the other. I just think that use all of the tools, even if within data, let's say you hate the eye test, fine. Within data, try and use multiple data points and data sets to try and just, you just basically don't want to be, again, closed-minded and just using one thing to make your decisions forever.
Yeah, I mean, so some of it kind of just comes down to, again, that idea of subjectivity. So how much do I trust others' views versus my own? I think some of it comes down to where you stand as an FPL manager or FPL player. So in contrast to you, Ross, maybe I'd always say that I'm not a particularly sophisticated watcher of football, and I like the content, which helps me understand that and get a better idea of kind of what's good. I could stuff like as Sam was saying earlier on, that sort of stuff, if you see it yourself, is always really satisfying. But often I miss that because I'm just not that way inclined. I'm good at understanding data, and it might be different for you. Maybe it's the other way around, where you need that sort of data, sort of a hand up. But in terms of watching football, you're really sort of nailing it, and you kind of get a good idea of kind of how that's all going to fit together. And it's a similar theme, isn't it, of judgment. This one's hard to manage as you kind of place different emphasis on your own research versus people you respect and their opinion, and kind of picking and choosing exactly what works for you. And for me, it's a case of sort of, quality versus quantity, to call back to what we were talking about before we got on to the gnarly area of the eye test versus the spreadsheets. And often I kind of get to the idea that quantity in terms of others' views kind of creates confusion for me. It doesn't for others, and people kind of find that quite useful. And I guess trying to ensure that you're kind of making sure that the mix of the advisory voices kind of fits you. I think that's what's really important here more than anything else. But there is one area that I suppose now FPL has gone global, helped, of course, by monoliths, behemoths like FPL Raptor. How much do I go with the crowd? I think that this is something which every year we see as being kind of the main source of, I don't know, the main source of division online a lot of the time. Like you're being template, you're just following what the content creators say. So it works quite nicely with the two. And of course, the template's a template for a reason. And we always say it, that a lot of the time the template's a template for a reason because it kind of makes sense. Some years it's very, very easy to put a team together. Some years it's not as easy. But yeah, herd mentality, Ross, is a huge one that I think affects managers a lot through the season. And I suppose it has been proven, if you think about kind of the days before analytics, the days of yore, that kind of playing safe has been something which has kind of classically worked out fairly well.
Yeah, I mean, we always say the template's a template for a reason, and people like if everyone's doing something normally, and not always, but normally, it probably is an okay decision at the very worst, and that's why it's getting harder because everyone does often do the same thing, and then it works out okay, and then to go against that can often backfire. I think for me, it's not even necessarily psychological here, but I would always just try to. only do what others are doing if it's something which you have, again, we'll go back to what Sam said, but like stress test, like gone through the process of why is that being done by everyone? Does the data back it, or does my eye test back it? Where does it fit within my decision-making framework? I feel like that's the only way to do it. But it does get to a point, like I even find this, I'm like, how do I know if I'm doing this because everyone else is doing it? Or would I have arrived at that same decision myself? So let's say I'm trying to bring in a striker and I bring in Mateta, but everyone else brought in Mateta. And I'm sat there thinking sometimes, yeah, I probably did bring in Mateta because a lot of other people did. But would I have arrived at that decision myself? I've got no idea. And it does get quite difficult to do. I think the only way that you can really get around things like herd mentality and groupthink, which, by the way, is essentially where your beliefs align with those around you, is just to limit the amount of content that you take in and limit the amount that you go on social media. But for some people, that's the enjoyable part. For some people, the enjoyment is being on social media. So if a byproduct of you being on social media and consuming content is that you do what a lot of other people do, so yeah, it's not a huge issue. But I would always try, if there are 300,000 managers bringing in the same player, just go and do your own research and decide if it's something you want to do. And don't be afraid to back against it. It's not a huge issue. Sometimes it won't pay off and sometimes it will. But the time that it does, it's going to feel absolutely amazing. I can guarantee that.
Yeah.
Chasing the dragon.
Yeah. And obviously a lot of times, and you've hinted at it there, I think both of you hinted at it there, a lot of the times that they're a popular pick for a reason. It's not like the most insane call in the world to be bringing in Mateta, for instance, but there is always an alternative. So it is worth, like I said earlier, stress testing it, trying to figure out what data you hold dear and which content creators, if you even listen to content creators, you want to kind of trust on these matters. And if they're all saying the same thing and that the data that you usually value highest is also suggesting that, then I think it's fair to say you probably would have arrived at the same decision yourself. And what's happened here is everyone's kind of arrived at the same logical decision because it's logical, not just because everyone's doing it. And there are weeks like that where a lot of people, even in the community, will say, oh, it's so template, it's so boring, like everyone's just following the herd and herd mentality is taking effect here, when actually I'm looking around and I'm thinking that's not why we're doing it. That it's just a good pick. Like you're captaining Salah at home to Southampton because Southampton are terrible and he's the best captain this week. It's as simple as that. But some people will always like to be maybe nibbling on social media and maybe trying to make you question whether you've done these things for the right reasons. So herd mentality is something to guard against. It's something to maybe, like I said, stress test and make sure you do your own research. But also don't be afraid of doing the same thing just because other people are doing it. It might be the most logical decision. And don't be afraid of coming to the same conclusion as everyone else, especially earlier on in the season where we're not fighting for those extra like 1 or 2 points to beat someone in your mini league or to get from 101k to 99k or 11k to 9k. It's those, obviously, at that point, it becomes a bit more tactical and you might want to intentionally go against the herd to expose yourself to variance, risk, whatever you want to call it. But it gives you that chance of added upside. But earlier on in the season, obviously, this is a preseason pod. You don't need to worry about that for a long time to come yet. So if it's a logical call, then there's no reason not to do it just because other people are doing it. Just make sure it makes sense. That's all.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd kind of throw in here is action bias, the tendency to favour action over inaction. And I think sometimes we kind of feel like we want to be doing something. And I've spoken about this many times about how there's a lot of benefit actually in doing nothing, obviously elevated by kind of 5 free transfers last year and something I failed. I think about Semmelweis reflex to kind of build into my game as well as I could have last year. I think I got to free transfers last year was the max I ever got to. But sometimes I think that you can feel like, that there's a sort of sway towards a certain player. There's all this buzz about a certain player. Everyone you'll be listening to, all of the thumbnails on YouTube, all of the main kind of talking points, the hot take will be, we've got to get this guy in over the next 5 weeks. And I think that Ross can be something which is really impactful in terms of influencing your decision making for a lot of managers. And it can be that you do just think, you know what, screw it, all right, I'm just gonna do it, I'm gonna go with it. But there's the other side of it, isn't there, where it's opportunity cost, where you basically forego that kind of extra flexibility next week if you do go with the favour of the week this week, which can at times, if we do follow action bias along, end up with us being in a situation where we end up having to take a -4 or something like that because of unforeseen circumstances, which forces into different decisions the week after. And these are all things that they're so difficult to foresee, but affect all FPL managers.
Yeah, action bias is such a funny one because it's one of those that's very hindsighty as well, where it's like in the times where you decide to have action and then you're like, the amount of times where, and you two would have had this, where you're like, if I didn't touch my team this week, I would have been 40 points. There was one time when I remember I changed my captaincy, made a transfer and changed like 2 benching decisions, and it cost me like 56 points. And I was like, if I'd have literally forgot the deadline, it was 2 seasons ago. It was unusual. I was like, if I'd have just forgot the deadline, I'd be 56 points better up in 1 week. And that's one of those where I'm like, action bias. But at the end of the day, I was always going to do something. And then it's on the flip side as well. Sometimes if you don't make a decision and you decide to just sit there and you're like, if I'd have just made the transfer that I was contemplating all week, then X, Y, Z. So again, it's going to be very hindsighty. There's a fine balance, but I would say every single manager will benefit from at some point in a week where they're tempted to do something from just sitting on their hands and not doing it, just to know what that feels like as well. Sometimes it'll be horrible and sometimes it will go horribly for you and you'll think, I'm not doing that again. I'm always going to make the decision. I always have this, it's kind of to protect me as a content creator slightly, but my cliche motto catchphrase is always, what would make you the most upset if it happened, right? So if you've got X or Y and you're like, if you made the move and it didn't pay off, would that upset you more? Or that if you didn't make it and as a result, you wish you had made it? So I always go through those in my mind. So let's say I'm looking at captaining a differential rather than Salah. I'm always like, what would annoy me more? Salah hauling and I've captained the differential, or Salah blanking the differential hauling and I've decided to captain Salah instead. And I always think about that in my mind because at the end of the day, again, FPL is about having fun and making decisions that you're happy with and you're proud of. And anyway, so back to action bias. I think at the end of the day, people would probably benefit from doing less with their team, and that might help with decision fatigue. But at the same time, I wouldn't just sit there and passively let the season go by, because you do want to try and have as much control as you can over the game weeks.
We'll get on to control in a second. I think that, but we're going to talk about it later on, but I think we'll bring it in here. Anticipated regret is basically what you've spoken about there. Dutch psychologist Mr. Zeelenberg is the expert in this, University of Tilburg. And I think regret is a uniquely human thing, feeling bad about an action or a thing that has happened. If you've got any pets, they're not going to feel any regret. If you've got a toddler, they have no regret whatsoever. But as you kind of grow up a little bit further, you do, unless you're a psychopath or a sociopath, or whichever one of the two you do kind of vibe with, there are kind of, most people do kind of feel this way. But anticipating it, Ross, is even more so, because you're forecasting feeling bad about something which hasn't occurred yet. Like that is the most sort of human thing I think you could possibly do. I think that kind of just puts paid to the idea that we all are predictable economic units and we're all sort of, endlessly sort of obvious. No way. We're all irrational animals, as Danny really said. And I think it is that we spoke about this when I was on your pod as well, on FPL Therapy on your show. It's so useful, I think, to help guide decisions, that idea. What would make me feel less bad? Which sounds so woolly, doesn't it? It sounds so kind of analytical. It's not particularly sort of tangible, but it's one of those things that kind of helps you just deal with the week-to-week rigmarole, the emotional roller coaster that FPL does sort of impact upon you.
Oh, I mean, it's probably a terrible way to make decisions, as I think you were trying to softly hint at, is that it's probably an awful way to make decisions. But what we also have to realize is that we're not very good probably at making decisions a lot of the time anyway, as we're trying to say here. So if we're not going to make the best decisions consistently anyway, at least make a decision that you're happy with. We're not going to get into this today, but people often ask me about gut feeling and what I think the role of gut feeling is in FPL and how much we can trust our gut feeling, and is it actually a useful thing to trust? And I always come back to probably not massively, but what gut feeling is good for is it at least you feel kind of content within yourself, that you trusted your gut feeling, you didn't listen to anyone else. We go back to how much do I go with the crowd? Well, you want to have that feeling of, right, I'm happy with my decision, I own it as well. So I think that's where it sort of links in there with anticipated regret. But it's such a weird and, like you say, human thing that not only do we have all of these other things to worry about all the time, but we're actually anticipating and predicting that we're not going to be regretful about something, which unfortunately then can negatively impact the way that we make decisions. But yeah, I want to keep emphasizing that really the main thing with FPL is that you enjoy it And I think as a result, anticipated regret might help you to decide which of these outcomes would upset me the most in the future and try and avoid that as much as you can.
Yeah. All right. So moving us on from this one, a few things. So template is template for a reason. There's adjustments to be made between whether a player is a bona fide asset or maybe something that's a bit of a flash in the pan to be avoided. You want to go against the crowd. And it's maybe worth, if you're not convinced, taking a breath and reconsidering jumping on a player, even if he's flavour of the week, safe knowledge, another one that's just around the corner, basically. Just try to make a decision, as Ross said earlier on, you're happy with. I've said it for years, but for me, it's not, did I make the right decision? It's more, am I happy with the decision that I made? It sounds very woolly, but kind of reflects what you said, Ross. I think it's probably the best way to kind of ensure that you're not kind of, burnt out by FPL come game week 20 something, effectively. Right. Final one. What variables can I control, Sam? And there's lots of things here. I think maybe the illusion of control is one that we've definitely spoken about a couple of times, Ross. When you were on, with Simon March, formerly of this parish, it was such an interesting one, and I think it kind of reflects in kind of. It's not so much preseason; it's more kind of during normal game weeks. It's why people, and I'm sorry, Sam, I do this sometimes. I say, "Oh, goal for blah blah," and you're like, "For God's sake, Tom, we haven't got this information in Newbury because all of the power lines are all done by horse and carriage." And why people scroll live FPL all the time when deadline is passed. It's sort of like surrogate behavior for actual action, as you can't do anything. But this energy needs to be expanded somewhere. I remember Ross a couple of years ago. You said it's almost like an exam, isn't it? You've written your exam. It's gone. It's the outcome's out of your hands once you've kind of just handed your paper in. It's such a big one that I think it impacts all of us because we can't do anything once the deadline's gone, and that's the key frustration for many managers.
I think you genuinely don't actually I don't think a lot of people realize this, myself included. When I sat down and actually realized on a Saturday morning when I submit my team, I can't do anything. Why am I checking live FPL? Why am I frantically waiting for whatever app I'm using to update and tell me who scored when really I can't do anything anyway, whether it's good or bad? And I'm not saying that you shouldn't sit there and watch football and scroll through your social media apps and try and celebrate, because that's what is fun about FPL, is that weekend drama and stuff. So definitely there. But illusion of control is we think as humans that we have control over a lot more in our lives than we do. This doesn't just go for FPL. This is a lot of stuff. If you actually reflect on your life, what can I control? How other people think about you is a really good one that I myself try to focus on. I can't really largely control that. I can portray who I am as a person as accurately as possible, but especially as content creators, we realize a lot of people don't like us. And really that's not up to me to decide. So I think illusion of control is really nice to think about. But as Tom was saying, I used to think back in the day when I did my exams, when you submit an exam and you put your pencil down, you think about that for weeks. Like, I did this wrong, I did that wrong. You're frantically waiting. Really, your grade is decided the moment you put your pen down. It's not actually marked at that moment, but as soon as you put your pen down, you can't really change anything. And it's the same in FPL. And I think that's a really nice feeling. And it also then makes you realize, actually, when you realize you can't change anything over the weekend, bloody hell, we can't actually do much to help our teams and to actually positively contribute. We can put a nice team together on paper, but if we get negative variance, bad luck, good luck, there's no control we can have over that. And it's quite like a cathartic, relaxing sort of realization that actually this game is a large amount of luck and I can't do much to help other than the decisions that I make throughout the week. And that's why I think this is useful. Go back to what variables can I control? The quicker you realize you can't control what happens at the weekend, the more you can actually improve your decision-making process. We've not really talked about outcome bias, but I think it links in quite nicely here that you don't want to focus on the outcome. You want to focus on the decisions and the process of the decision-making. And so I think forget what happens at the weekend, focus on what happens Monday to Friday. That's where most of you could probably improve in FPL.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we've spoken about an awful lot, Sam, isn't it? The idea that, as Ross said, it's not so much, well, obviously it is. So it's just very, you don't want to be in that situation where you're like, oh, actually, self-serving bias again. Oh, the decision was great, but the outcome didn't quite work. And sometimes it's going to happen. If it was a random game, if we were playing, fancy tiddlywink or something like that, then maybe we'd be in a slightly different situation. But the inherent randomness of football is what's there. But that sort of feeling of powerlessness, I think, is what's kind of what's addictive and also what's sort of a bit of a self-punishment masochistic part of FPL almost, that you're like, yeah, you know what, I'm putting this team for whatever. And the best part is when you put a terrible team in this week, or what you deem it to be a terrible team in, and it's gone off and got you kind of 85 points. And the other side is when you're like, we said this several times last season, I've got absolutely no rank threats here. I am bang on for a green arrow. You know, it's great, it's fantastic, and you end up with 50 points. And then there's like 7 or 8 of the players that you don't own who are 20% EO all managed to get double-digit points. Like, it is such a frustrating thing, but it's frustrating and also very addictive, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's the lack of control. I attribute as the reason that we enjoy FPL in the first place. It would not be as fun or as addictive a game if we did have complete control over the outcomes each week, because there'd be really no reward in it. There'd be no vindication when you've taken a risk and you get the points for it. There'd be no, I mean, half the point of life, I guess, without getting too deep, is the fact that there are lows and there are highs, and without the lows, then the highs would be pretty boring themselves because they wouldn't feel quite so high. So you need those bad game weeks. You need that lack of control, I guess, to throw up the surprises and to throw up the drama in that Saturday to Monday evening window. That's why we play the game, and it's not always going to go our way. And I think that's okay. And the sooner that I guess that you accept that we don't have control, as soon as our pencils are down and we have no more decisions to make once the deadline has passed until next game week, the only thing you can do at that point is start regretting things. And if you just put your pencil down and you just sort of enjoy the ride for the next 2.5, 3 days, however long the game week is, and try and enjoy the football, then switch back into decision-making mode once it's all done. I think that's the best way of having stamina in this game, and again, trying to come back to the game with a fresh mindset come the next game week, rather than maybe dwelling over decisions made or opportunities missed from the last game week. Because as we've discussed with several different biases here already, that lives to serve no one. That's got no benefit whatsoever. So yeah, I think there's a major benefit to the lack of control that we have in FPL, and I think that's something that maybe we forsake sometimes and maybe overlook. And I think that's something that we should try and learn to enjoy.
Yeah, I think in the FPL format, when you think about which variables can I control, in the FPL format, we've historically had very few inputs actually beyond what I call distance guidance. So we spoke about kind of having 800, 900 decisions you make per week. But as you said, Ross, once the pencil or pen is down, then actually you kind of have nothing that you can possibly do except enjoy the ride, as Sam said. And I think it's some of the 5 stages of grief, isn't it? It's like you come to acceptance after a while that, hey, you know what? There's nothing I can do. I can kind of sit there on live FPL. I can sit there kind of looking at, we all do it. Once the game week is live on live FPL, we will look at where our rank is. And if we haven't taken a hit, kind of see, oh, well, I've risen 2k places because I haven't taken a hit. Or I've dropped 20k because I've taken -4. And then try to think about, what do I do to get beyond this? And I think that's part and parcel of the fun of it. Is it fun? I'm not even sure anymore. But I think that's kind of just part and parcel of the game that we play. And that's kind of the big thing about it, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's the fun and the pain all mixed into one. But I think at the end of the day, as we said, just acceptance is probably the best thing that you could experience in FPL. Just accepting that you're largely, as much as we want to control, we are just kind of pulled along by what happens, which is out of our control. Because at the end of the day, you can make perfect decisions every single week, but you can't control what 11 versus 11 across 10 games, hundreds of players. Try to predict what human beings are doing. We've spent the whole podcast saying human beings are unpredictable. You're trying to predict what footballers are doing, which are also human beings. It's completely impossible to try and do. So that little bit of acceptance. And listen, we say, all you have to do is just accept that it's really difficult. All 3 of us in game week 1 are going to be checking our live ranks and worrying about it. We all do it.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think just acknowledging all of the biases that we spoke about today, and just acknowledging we're not perfect. There's a large element of luck, how you can actually improve your decision making. But again, I said I'd do it right at the end. Have fun with FPL. I remember I said something at the end of my book, which was along the lines of the real winners in FPL are the ones that have fun. Oh, look, there you go. Sam's got a copy there.
I was going to plug it at some point, but yeah, you brought it up.
But like really, I remember I got loads of kickback on that. I had a couple of negative reviews on Amazon and said, this guy said that the real winners are those that have fun and not get a good rank. Of course, largely, if you do well in FPL, you'll have fun. But for me, truly, from the bottom of my heart, if you finish 4 million, but love it, and I mean like love it, you chat to your family about it, you have fun with your friends, you watch the football, your weekends are filled with fun, and you finish, somehow you enjoy it finishing 4 million. I don't know how. Or you win FPL, but you're anxious every week, you're sweating at the weekend, you don't speak to your family because all you're doing is looking at your live rank. That isn't what the game's about, for goodness sake. You're not supposed to win at all costs. For me, anyway, it's supposed to be a hobby. So I think everything should be brought back to, even if you're going through the cognitive biases, like how can you work out how to manage yourself best to enjoy the game best? And that for me is what I'm always trying to work on to perfect. And I've been doing this for years, and so is Sam and Tom, and we're still working on that. But I think at the start of every season, I try and remind myself that this is a game which is meant to bring us fun, and that helps me to reset, especially when I'm struggling.
Yeah, it's so true, isn't it, that you can lose sight of it. And I think that, you know, the early days for me, I certainly took it quite seriously, and that had sort of real world impacts almost beyond the heuristics and biases we've spoken about. And I think that within the world of FPL, these things should be contained within that. Obviously, they're all very useful and applicable outside of FPL, but I like to kind of ensure that they're sort of in their lane when it comes to FPL, and I'm trying to think about them exclusively about how I can do better as a manager. And obviously, there are loads of ways to do better as a manager, as we all found out over the last 9 years now. But as Ross said, it's always about that. I mean, I think about beyond just having a nice chat with Sam and having a couple of beers, what makes me come back to doing this every week? And it is about that kind of enjoyment of the game and enjoyment of kind of the unpredictability and the beautiful unpredictability of FPL. And there's loads of different ways that we can try to control it. We've spoken about that. Loads of different ways we can try to figure out how we negotiate our own kind of judgment versus the judgment of other people, and how we sort of bring that all together and synthesize what we think, how we sort of value data. But at the end of the day, I think you're really right, Ross, that it's all about how much you enjoy FPL. And I think that that's really key. And hopefully today we've given you a good example of kind of, okay, these are ways which you can kind of think about to try to improve. But Ross's first point about kind of bias blindness is bias blind spot is really important in terms of just making sure that you're not kind of saying, yeah, I'm perfect, it's great, I've got nothing to learn here. And if you listen this far, I'm sure you know that.
I love that. That's a really good roundup of the pod. And yeah, thank you, Ross, so much for coming on. I really especially enjoyed the we're all flawed human beings. That's something that I need to make sure I continuously remind myself every single week. And yeah, I've really enjoyed this one. I've been a little bit more of a fly on the wall than normal because you guys are such pros with this. It's really, really interesting hearing what you guys think. And yeah, really enjoyed it. Hopefully you all out there did as well. We'll be back for more preseason content. You'll probably be in a series of 2 or 3 already, even though we've pre-recorded this one. So hopefully you're enjoying the preseason so far. Ross, as we reach the end, thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it. I think this is the first one where I've been on Who Got the Assist with you at the same time. So it's been great actually being able to ask a few questions live and ping thoughts off of you every now and then. So really appreciate you coming on. And we'll plug everything in a second. We'll do all the social handles. But yeah, for now, thank you very much, mate.
No, thank you. It's my pleasure. And Tom, thanks again for the invite on. And we'll do this again, hopefully soon as well, whether that be psychology or FPL. But it's always a pleasure chatting with you boys.
Yeah, we'll do a roundup at the end of this season when one of us wins FPL, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it won't be me.
We'll all we'll surf the wave of psychological impacts, and we'll all come out on top. Yeah, thanks very much, Ross. It's been brilliant to have you on. And yeah, always really, it's just so interesting to, I feel like it's just such an engaging conversation talking about this sort of thing. And I hope you will enjoy it too.
Yeah. Thank you all, everyone, so much. As always, we have been Who Got the Assist. You can find us on X at WGTA_FPL or FPL Pricey, Instagram and Threads, WGTA.FPL or FPL Pricey on there. But we have a third, and I think most of you will probably already follow him on most of these channels anyway. But Ross, would you like to just remind anyone who might not be following you at this point what your channels are? And of course, if you would like to have a chat about your book, which goes very much into detail on everything we've discussed today and much further, then please feel free to use this spot to do so as well.
We both read it. It's very, very, very interesting, and
Love it.
It sounds up. I'm pretty sure Ross is. My entire mattress is basically your book. Because I've been tricked into buying that. It's a massive misconception about how psychology works. But yeah, no, definitely go ahead.
Yeah, go on, Ross. Remind us of your tags and go. Where can we find the book?
Yeah, you can just search for FPL Wrapped on any socials. I guess the thing I would like to promote, if you're listening to this point, you've listened to an hour and 20 of us rambling on, is actually FPL Therapy, which is my podcast that started last season. And I had Sam and Tom both on. I think Sam came on a couple of times. I'll invite you both on again for this season, I'm sure. So yeah, just if you want more podcast and audio content, check out FPL Therapy. And yeah, if you're interested in the book, I don't actually know how many copies are left and stuff. I don't know if we'll do another print run, but it's called The Mind Game FPL. So if you just type in The Mind Game FPL on Amazon, it will probably pop up, or if you look for the links on my socials. But yeah, if you're thinking, oh, I really enjoyed this, but I want more info, I think it was like 60,000 words, literally just about psychology and how it applies to FPL, which is very niche and nerdy, but I see people seem to enjoy it. So yeah, if you want to check out the book, feel free to do so.
That's exactly why people will be listening to this pod. So I think this is absolute product market fit right here. You couldn't pay for better product market fit. Anyway, if you did enjoy the pod, please follow us on those socials, including Ross's and FPL Therapy as well. Fantastic show, by the way, in studio, top quality stuff. Can't wait to be on again, hopefully this season. Give the pod a 5-star rating wherever you're listening to it, Spotify, iTunes, whatever. And of course, if you're watching along on YouTube, which a few of you are these days, leave a like, hit subscribe. You won't miss out on any future content. And that's very quickly becoming my most common phrase these days. So yeah, please do it so I don't have to say it so often. And yeah, thank you all so much for listening to this preseason podcast. We can't wait to have you back yet again.
Yeah, enjoy some very nice thumbnails for FPL Pricey this year. I know that Mr. Raptor also has some fantastic thumbnails, but if you want to see Sam looking like the Terminator, go ahead and look at that. Red eyes. There's also a kind of cyclops in both eyes. It's really cool. And also on Blue Sky, I'm at Who Got the Assist. But yes, thanks both. We'll be back next week for more preseason content. We hope this. Do you think about psychological traps FPL managers may fall into? Thanks so much for your time. We'll speak to you again very, very soon.
Oh, it's a goal. Who got the assist? Who got the assist?